I've been able to examine those strategies that we have found to be effective, both at the elementary level as well as at the high school level. And so today, the SAMR model is just one of these models that we're going to explore and together examine the benefits and those places where there are gaps in terms of how this model helps to support effective integration in the classroom. But before we dive into the topic of the SAMR model, I want to pose a question to you about why is this topic important to you? So take a moment, if you would, in the chat box and share with us why this topic matters to you and to your work. And please don't be shy.
Thanks, Dr. Hope. We've got a few responses coming in here. I'll just give it another second for them to gather up.
Sure, thank you.
We've got a few folks who are suggesting that they're here to try and learn a little better how to integrate technology in the classroom. I'm just looking at a few of these additional responses. Want to make sure we're fully utilizing all the technology our district has available, give students the best way to learn. One attendee moving to one-to-one instruction and want to make sure that she's thoughtful about how to use the technology in her English class.
Okay.
Sometimes feel that it doesn't change instruction and learning that much, but wants to see that happen.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you so much for sharing. So, you all, the responses that you've shared reflect many of the types of responses that I hear all over the country. So anytime a district or a building, or quite frankly, a classroom teacher is trying to figure out effective integration of a new tool, and the tool of choice for us right now is technology, but anytime we're grappling with how do we effectively integrate a new tool, there's always this angst around, am I doing it right? Should I really be focusing my efforts here? Where are those places where this tool works really, really well? And where are those best practices at that I can take a look at to hopefully kind of try to replicate in my schools and my districts, or quite frankly, at the state level, if we have some state participants here. So our discussion guideposts today, I think these will guide our conversation, but I think more specifically, they're going to answer these very specific questions and interests that you've expressed. And so our 4 discussion points today will be around the what, the why, the how, and what next. More specifically, our essential questions this afternoon will be those of what exactly is the SAMR model? Why the SAMR model? Why even pay attention to it? Is this model valuable in the classroom? And then thirdly, how can the SAMR model inform instructional design? So how can I put this model to practice to inform how my teachers plan, to inform how my teachers reflect about instruction, and then more specifically and potentially, how do I monitor effective technology integration? And so we're going to explore these 3 questions together. I will share with you several examples of effective implementation that we've seen across the country, and then point you to some very specific tools and resources that can help continue to support your investigation of this SAMR model. But before we begin this conversation, I think it's important that we always reinforce the heart of the matter. And that heart of the matter is the students. So these essential questions, these guideposts, the what, why, how, and what's next, all of that's predicated on the fact that we serve young people and we serve students, pre-K 20. I think the National Research Council says it best, that learning begins with who students are and what they know, and that we as educators are responsible for extending and deepening that learning from that point. And so with that sentiment, we will examine the SAMR model together. And so starting with who our students are, let's do a quick revisit, and this is not new to many of you on the phone call, on this webinar with us today, but quite frankly, the students that we serve, they are known as digital natives. And so this term was coined originally by a researcher by the name of Mark Prensky in two seminal research articles that he wrote back in 2001, where he attempted to codify what a digital native is, the implications around how they make choices, and more specifically, the implications of these young people in the classroom. And so Mark Prensky's work reflects not just U.S. schools, but schools internationally as well. And there are some very common factors that are reflected in digital natives. So first and foremost, we know that these young people and digital natives encompass the age group of basically our pre-K 20 students today. So the students that are in our classrooms today, age 5 to about 21. And the traits that our digital natives reflect, and again, understanding that these young people have never known a world without computers, without the internet. They're highly interactive. They love and understand video games at levels and depths that I will never understand. And the cellular phone is a part of their world. And more specifically, as we think about these digital natives in the classroom, these are the attributes that we know and are seeing reflected in the classroom with them. So first and foremost, these young people learn by doing. They want to get their hands dirty. They want to be involved in solving messy, complex, complicated problems that, quite frankly, impact their world around them. These are young people that learn and access learning just in time. So these are not individuals that, certainly in my day and perhaps my parents' days, where you start with a manual, an instructional manual, and you read it from cover to cover. Digital natives, they access instruction just in time, when they need it, as they attempt to solve problems. Multimedia is the king over text for digital natives. They will immediately reach out and go to YouTube or access audio files to gain information that they need. And quite frankly, with the fourth element, that information they can access immediately. They Google it when they need it. They quickly tap into the various social channels to gain information. Digital natives are content consumers. They are constantly consuming information from multiple inputs and through different modalities to inform the world as they know it. They're highly networked, highly social, and they have an uncanny ability to multitask, to have the television on, to have their iPod playing, to be on 3 or 4 different devices as they attempt to complete the task at hand. So these are the students that we have the responsibility of serving today. And so when we think about the teaching and learning implications for this type of learner, these are the things that research has shown us that educators have to do in the classroom to effectively engage our young people to ensure that the learning is occurring in a way that is extending their existing knowledge, but also is transferring into the application realm where these young people can apply their new information to solve problems that matter to them. So our learners need choice. They need the opportunity to make decisions around the path that they take, the pace at which they go, the modality that they use. So choice is critically important. They need the opportunity to be challenged with multiple perspectives and ideas. So again, solving messy problems that have different voices. This whole idea of a global context, critically important for our learners. Again, understanding that they access information through multiple channels. They're highly networked, highly social. So the ability to solve problems that matter is critically important. Real-world interaction, the ability, again, to tap into the subject matter experts that can inform their work to help them to solve these challenging perspectives and problems. Feedback, critically important, again, for a group of students where video simulation is in there every day when they're outside of school. That feedback, understanding the rules of engagement are critically important as they make decisions about their learning. And again, highly collaborative, highly social, and the importance of being able to access information 24/7. So nothing surprising there, right? So when we think about the SAMR model and exploring the implications of the SAMR model in our own practice in the classrooms, or as we support teachers that are working to integrate the technology into the classroom, let's quickly examine this teaching tool of technology, and explore the notion of what technology's impact is into the classroom. So I want you to take a quick second, and in your chat box, answer the question for me: does technology impact student outcomes? Take a quick moment. What's the evidence that technology, or is there evidence that demonstrates that technology impacts student outcomes in the classroom? What are your thoughts?
Got a response here. It depends on how technology is used.
Yeah.
Students are able to collaborate and interact with the real world, so yes, it does impact student outcomes. If the students are more engaged, their effort is more genuine along with their learning.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So good. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for those of you that shared. So absolutely, there's the idea of student engagement, the idea of students being able to collaborate and communicate and to demonstrate their learning differently because of the tools, absolutely spot on. However, when we examine rigorous research, so research that aligns to the sniff test of the USDA What Works kind of framework, there is limited evidence today that stands up the idea that specific features of technology actually improve the learning. What the research does tell us is exactly what many of you have indicated, that technology in and of itself doesn't enhance the learning. It depends on how the technology is designed and how it's implemented, how teachers are supported to use the technology, how the outcomes are measured, and then what are the communities in place to support it. So this theme and this idea of it's not the tool, but it's the how, and it's the practice and the behavior of how that tool is used is critically important. So yes, it engages our students. Yes, it gives our students opportunity to demonstrate and to create and produce, show outcomes differently. But when we really think about just the tool in and of itself, there is not firm evidence that shows us that it's the tool alone. And to take it even further, and I'm showing you several additional research articles, but I'm going to shift more specifically to this research that talks about math and language arts. What the research really pans out is that what matters most is how students and teachers use the technology to develop and extend their knowledge and skills. And that successful technology integration for learning, it generally goes hand in hand with changes in teacher training, curriculum, and assessment practices. Again, probably not surprising to many of you. And so when we look at these evidences around math proficiency and reading performance increases, again, those increases in student outcomes, it's generally tied to those teachers who have adapted their instruction to effectively integrate the technologies. Their students typically perform better. And so this whole idea and this whole notion of technology in the classroom, quite frankly, what the research is showing us and what the evidence is that we're finding in research that's showing us, it's showing us that the learning powered by technology has a power source of an effective teacher and the effective use of that technology. And this is why the SAMR model is critically important in helping us to support and to reflect and to plan appropriately in terms of how we leverage the technology tool. More specifically, to support several of the comments that many of you shared, the research and the evidence does in fact pan out that learning powered by technology does great things to increase personalization, student engagement, and content enhancement. Research shows that when technology is effectively integrated in the classroom, that to the tune of 76% personalization, we see increases. Student engagement increases by 77%. And then increased access to the content and to the understanding of the content, that increase happens by the number of 77%. And then from the teacher's perspective, leveraging the technology, it helps them to obtain and have access to near real-time student data to guide and inform and change their teacher practice based on the needs of their students. So again, great teaching hasn't changed. Krista Mortar said it best, that great teaching hasn't changed, the toolbox has. So our tool, technology, it helps us to engage, to create access, to increase automaticity and efficiencies, to increase communication, and to support increased collaboration in our classrooms and among students and teachers. And so when we think about this and this idea of technology, and we see that technology is a tool that impacts engagement, we are still finding, though, that there are barriers in the classrooms with this effective use. Quickly, if you would, again, take a moment. What are some barriers that you have encountered either directly in the classroom or directly as you support teachers in the classroom in terms of use and integration of the technology? What are some barriers that you've encountered?
Access is one of the comments here that I'm getting, and infrastructure. Lack of confidence on the part of teachers, teacher resistance, and proper training, the teacher's time to learn new tools, district or school policies that may block resources.
Yeah. Okay. I think many of you must have read the exact same research that I've been reading. There are 6 common barriers that we see in the K-12 classroom. And again, not just here in the United States, but internationally. These 6 barriers are pretty consistently and pretty prevalent in the K-12 experience. In 2006, there was a study conducted by Hugh and Brush, and they confirmed these 6 general barriers that are exactly what you've indicated: lack of resources, knowledge and skill, institutional barriers, attitudes and beliefs, the assessment and accountability climate that we live in. These are this, and then this idea of subject culture specific. These are the 6 common barriers that research shows is encountered in the K-12 space. And when we say lack of resources, which is actually the leading barrier, it's not just access to the tool, it also includes access to the infrastructure not supporting the consistent ease and use of the tool. It also, when lack of resources, and for the purpose of this study, also included scarcity of time, both on the planning side as well as on the actual instructional delivery side. And then also under lack of resources, that also includes inadequate technical support. These are very, very real gaps that we see prevalent in schools all over the country, which is why it's the leading barrier in the K-12 space. The second leading barrier, many of you indicated that in your experience as well, is this idea of knowledge and skill. And in the study, what this means is that even when the proper resources are present, teachers often struggle with an inadequate knowledge of the specific technology or a gap in understanding of the technology-supported pedagogy that supports effective use, or how to effectively manage the classroom when this technology is integrated into the classroom. And these things have created the fear that many of you have cited being exhibited by your teachers and or some of your administrators. This third idea, which actually is almost tied with attitudes and beliefs, but the institutional barriers. These are factors outside of the classroom that include leadership, the school schedule, so inflexible schedules, the school planning, parents, policies. So if there's not an effective student data privacy policy or some of these protection policies that some districts have in place that filter out content that prohibit teachers and students from accessing certain content. So some of these institutional barriers are real and are impacting teachers' ability to effectively use the technology. And then this idea of the attitudes and the beliefs. Again, this is, this notion of many of us teach the way we were taught. And so many of us that are in the classroom, we're supporting teachers that are in the classroom today. Many of our teachers, if we take a look at some of the data about the demographics that make up our K-12 classrooms in the US, many of our teachers did not grow up with the technology. So they're immigrants, digital immigrants, to use a term that the research uses. And so there's some hesitancy and some fear around using these tools, and some of the fear is also driven by the fact that the students are much more proficient and well-versed in the technology, which causes teachers to have fear around how they can control and manage students' access and students' usage of the tool. So the fear and these attitudes and beliefs are very, very real. And then finally, the final two barriers of assessment and subculture, subject culture, is one of, in this accountability age in which we live, more and more we're finding that instructional time is being dedicated to testing and to focused on test-taking skills. And so in this space of high-stakes testing, national and state normed referenced assessments that oftentimes don't reflect the 21st century skills that can be difficult to assess at times from a bubble and selected response type of testing methodology. That kind of focus on high stakes testing also serves as a barrier that in some ways can inhibit the creativity and the experimentation that teachers need to use the technology. And then finally, this idea of the subject culture component, where some teachers take on the idea that, oh, that's a math thing, or that's something they do in the technology classes, or that's something that only can work in science. I can't use this tool in my ELA class. So there is also the belief that technology is not appropriate in certain subject areas. And so that's where some additional work is needed. And this is where the SAMR model comes into play in helping us to help teachers reflect and to examine their choice of tools as they build out instructional activities for their students. PBS Learning Media recently released this infographic that I love that says teachers do in fact embrace the technology and they recognize the power of the technology to support teaching and learning. But when we examine those areas where teachers typically use the technology, it's more on the side of games. So we all probably, many of us are aware of Study Island or Brain Pop. Many of teachers use the technology for online planning, so to access other planning resources. And then also they leverage them for video and images and articles that they can build into their instruction. But one of the things that we're finding is as teachers hover in these beginning places of using the technology to access games or to visit websites, there's additional work that can be done to push and stretch our teachers to really tap into the power that the technology tool avails our students. And that's where the SAMR model comes into place. So let's talk about it. What exactly is the SAMR model? So this model was developed a little over 5 years ago by Dr. Ruben Pentadora, who, interestingly enough, has a PhD in chemistry. He is not a formally trained educator, K-12 educator. He is a trained chemist. And however, in his work, as he's supported different institutions like hospitals and different public and private sector institutions, he encountered and began to examine some themes around learning and what takes place with learning and how we learn when certain tools are introduced into the learning. And so Dr. Pentadora developed this model called SAMR, which is an acronym that summarizes a 4-stage model for examining and understanding one's use of the educational technology. Now, the SAMR model is often described as a ladder of integration, so it's a progression that moves from the S progressively to the R. And it's a useful tool for helping teachers to identify and examine their current use of the technology in order to design purposeful and meaningful student learning experiences that happen to use this tool of technology. So let's dig in. So when we think about the SAMR model, understanding that its intent and its purpose is to help teachers design purposeful and meaningful student learning experiences that leverage technology, we start with this foundational level. And this is called the substitution level. At this level, the guiding question that typically drives this level of technology integration is one of, what can I gain by replacing the task with the new technology? There's no functional change to the teaching and learning itself. Essentially, at this level, we're replacing an old tool with a new tool. Now, I just want to be clear. I'm going to walk through what each of these letters mean, and then we're going to dive more deeply into specific examples across the K-12 classroom, both at the math level, English language arts, science, etc. So I'm just going to walk through just so you can clearly know what each of these letters stand for. So this is substitution. And again, no functional change in the teaching and learning, just swapping out an old tool for a new tool. So replacing paper and pencil with a word processor. That's what the substitution level is. At the augmentation level, the guiding question here is, does the technology add new features that actually improve upon the technology, the task at hand? And so the guiding question here is, have I added any improvement to the task process that could be accomplished that could not be accomplished with the older technology? How does this feature contribute to the design of the task? And so we're going to examine more deeply a few examples, but I just want to put top of mind, this is now where features and functionality of the technology begin to inform the task that students are confronted with. And as a result of infusing in these additional features and functionalities of the technology, students also begin to become more engaged in the learning. As we move to the third level, modification. At this level, the question that guides this work is, how does the task significantly change with this use of the technology? So this is where we begin to redesign the task, and the technology begins to play an important role. And so now the modification is beginning to fundamentally change the task that the student is being asked to complete. There is a significant functional change in the classroom. The computer technology is now necessary in the classroom for this function to happen. You'll begin to see increased collaboration between the students and the teachers, begin to see increased feedback, greater efficiencies will now be captured. when you see modification leveraged in the classroom. And then finally, the fourth level, redefinition. And at this level, the common classroom task, it cannot exist without the technology. So the task has been completely redesigned and redefined. And at this level, the student is now the center of the learning, and the student is now driving much of the development of the task and the process by which the task is being completed. And so here the guiding questions that are typically top of mind with teachers is, so what is the new task? Will any portion of the original task be retained? How is the new task uniquely made possible because of the technology? And how has the technology contributed to a new task that's been designed? And so this is the SAMR model. So substitution is the beginning level, augmentation is the next level, modification, and then redefinition. So we quickly walk through what SAMR model is defined as. I want to now define what SAMR is not. The SAMR model is not about technology. Richard Wells, an education blogger, I think he captured it really, really well when he said the focus of the SAMR model is really on the task and the process and not the technology. The technology solely serves as a tool to help facilitate the learning towards the end student outcome, the outcome that we have in mind for the student. And so the SAMR model brings attention to this question of how does the technology support the learning outcome? How does the technology support collaboration and inquiry and research and design? Does the technology tool align to the learning outcomes? The SAMR model informs effective instruction and instructional planning. This model examines its sole purpose and function is to examine the tasks, the processes, and the tools to support authentic and effective instruction. So the SAMR model is a tool, and it's a tool to inform lesson design for technology integration and to guide teachers in their reflection on the use of that technology as a teaching tool. That's the primary focus of the SAMR model. The SAMR model is not a teaching framework. It's not an instructional framework. It is a tool to inform effective use of teaching tools, and in this case, that teaching tool is technology. Now, many of you may have done some additional research on the SAMR model, and you have found that there are some extensions of the SAMR model that have built upon the Bloom's taxonomy as well as the Webb's depth of knowledge. And you will see that there are some individuals that have done some additional work to make that next extension of the SAMR model. Our conversation today will not examine those areas. I will share with you some resources that do a fantastic job of delving deeper with this next step of the SAMR model of attaching or connecting SAMR to Bloom's and to Webb's depth of knowledge. And so I'll be sure to point those resources out when we get to that point of our presentation today. But we will not delve deeply into how SAMR connects to Bloom's taxonomy and the Webb's depth of knowledge. Now, I will say, in light of that particular comment about what SAMR is not, like all things in most fields, there are pros and cons, supporters and critics. And like most models and tools, in particular in the education arena, it's always of the utmost importance that we pay attention to the intent and the purpose of a tool so that it can inform our use and more specifically our interpretations of those outcomes. And so with that said, the SAMR model has both supporters and critics. And some of the things that you'll find that critics have alluded to or have explicitly stated is that the SAMR model has little theoretical support that has been peer-reviewed. Now, not unlike many educational technology approaches and products, The dearth of peer-reviewed research causes pause for many. And so SAMR is no different than some of these other technology approaches or these technology integration approaches that currently are in our space, where peer-reviewed research is an ongoing, it's in its developmental stages. However, critics have noted that that is a concern for them when they take a look at the SAMR model. Another criticism that has come up specific to the SAMR model is the concern around the ambiguity that exists in the augment stage and the modification stage. So the lowest and the highest level, substitution and redefinition, respectively, are very well defined. And what that means is, as a teacher that's attempting to identify if a task or practice in my lesson is solely substituting an older technology, or if a task or practice that I'm having students do, is it redefining and substantially changing how the learning is happening? That from a pragmatic vantage point, that's very easy to do. Teachers are able to very easily make that identification and that classification. However, what many educators and researchers are finding with the SAMR model is that the middle two levels of augmentation and modification appear to be imprecise, and they pose confusion in terms of lesson task identification and application. And so what that translates to is, and we'll unpack this more when we take a look at some of the examples, but teachers have noted that there are times when they find it difficult to discern if a specific learning activity or a specific integration of the technology falls within the augmentation or in the modification level. And so greater work is needed there to help stand up the robust identification of what classifies as augmentation and modification. And so that's some of the criticism that exists with the SAMR model. But with that said, there are lots of benefits and positives to the SAMR model that help to inform how teachers plan and how teachers reflect about how they're using the tool of technology. And so even as we look at what supporters say or what critics say, from my vantage point, if we're taking the positive lean, where we're leaning more towards learner-focused, learner-directed, learner-centered outcomes and activities and instruction, then I think that's a leaning that we want to move. And so where the effort and the investment is being made by teachers to unpack and to discover where they're making planning decisions about activities, I'm excited with the idea that teachers are taking the time and making the effort to discover where their instructional activities fall out. And so to me, that's good news. Even in the confusion, that's good news. That effort is being made to ensure that our students are grappling with real-world content using today's tools. So we talked about the pros and cons. So let's look at some of the research that Dr. Puntador has identified. So he's taken the effort to identify research that was already completed. So it's a bit of a meta-analysis where researchers looked at the use of technology or multimedia resources in a K-12 environment, and he's taken those research frameworks and the findings, and he has classified them within the continuum of the SAMR model. And so what you see, what I'm sharing with you here, is several research briefings that have been identified that fall within the SAMR model that demonstrate effect size impact on academic outcomes and student growth. And so for your own understanding, an effect size of 0.40, anything above an effect size of 0.40, typically demonstrates in a K-12 in an education environment. It typically demonstrates an effect of an impact of a typical year of academic experience or student growth. So 0.4 or higher is a very solid indication that whatever the instructional practice is has had a positive effect on student outcomes. An effect size of 1.0 or better is equivalent to advancing the student's achievement level by at least a full grade level. So getting to an effect size of at least a 1 or higher is pretty tremendous. So let's take a look at some of these studies that have been identified to fall within the SAMR model. So the first one is a research that identified direct instruction that was provided to some students that were at risk solely at the substitution level. So it was basically replacing a text intervention model with a computer-based intervention model. And it had an effect size of about 0.02. So nothing substantial, but it did have a 0.02 effect size. As you move down the continuum of the SAMR model into the modification and the redefinition, those places where modification of the task through the use of technology, where things like text-to-speech were introduced, where feedback was provided and support was provided, where students were actually creating and producing their own responses using technology, the effect size is pretty tremendous, a 0.6 and a 1.563 respective. So moving down the continuum from a substitution towards that of modification and redefinition can have a tremendous impact on student growth. These are two additional studies that also demonstrate, again, the implications of activities that fall within a substitution or an augmentation level versus that of a modification level. So again, to the extent that students are leveraging tools that allow them to create, to narrate, to collaborate, they're seeing tremendous effect sizes that speak towards student growth. Now, to be balanced, I think it's also important to identify that there are other instructional practices as well that do not leverage technology. And so this is I want to be very clear that and be balanced as we talk about effect sizes and effective instructional practice. And so John Hattie's work, Captured Invisible Learning, which is an exhaustive meta-analysis in education, Hattie was able to identify hinge points, is what he called them, which are basically instructional practices that have had a substantial effect on student growth and student academic experience. So again, remembering that a 0.40 or above speaks towards a typical year of growth, and then a 1.0 or higher speaks to an advancement in student achievement by the level of a full academic year. And so in his work found in Visible Learning, Hattie identified several dozen instructional practices that have a positive impact. And I've identified here, I've outlined about 10 instructional practices that have been found to have an effect size of at least 0.70, which is pretty amazing. So you see there classroom discussion, feedback, the teacher-student relationship, the effectiveness of the teacher, student self-assessment and self-grading. All of these instructional practices too have a positive effect size on student outcomes. And this work you can find, and these sources will be shared with you as well at the end of the presentation so that you can go and examine this research more carefully as well. Interestingly enough, with Hattie's work, what was not found as an effect size or had a minimal effect size was that of one's social economic status and one's home factors. Many of these or all of these instructional practices that are on the screen right now had a greater effect size than one's SES and one's home outcomes. So again, just underscoring the fact that great teaching hasn't changed, but the toolbox has. So let's look at some examples, more specific examples of some instructional practices that fall on the continuum of the SAMR model. So when we look at substitution, these are some basic examples for substitution. Swapping out paper and pencil with the word processor. Instead of having students stand at the chalkboard to do a math explanation or using chart paper, you use the smartboard. Using concept mapping software to demonstrate relationships instead of paper and pencil. So again, taking the old technology and swapping it out for new technology. The task is still the same, but the tool is different. When we look at augmentation, the types of activities that reflect that is moving the word processor document into a Google document so that students can share it with their teachers and with their peers. Using a back channel tool for whole class note-taking. So again, opening up the opportunity for peers to collaborate and to share information together. Students taking a quiz using a Google form instead of using the paper pencil. Again, functionally leveraging the functions of the technology to create efficiencies within the task. The task is relatively the same, but we're now leveraging the functionality of the technology to create greater efficiencies, which also increases student engagement. So again, students are still, in the first example, they're still taking notes, but they're now leveraging the technology as a means to share and to collaborate. And the tool, the technology tool, is what's facilitated that. In the level of modification, a couple of examples here. Students are now taking notes using a screencasting tool, and they're adding an audio component and posting that online for their peers. So again, now they're adding the opportunity to add comments to their notes, which adds additional color. They're allowing their peers to respond and to make additions or corrections. And so with the other examples, similarly, the students are writing an essay. They then are to record them delivering the essay, and then they're to add a soundtrack kind of as a backdrop to their delivery of the essay. And then they post that essay and have an audience score their delivery and their nuances and their mechanics of their delivery and of their essay in and of itself. And so the difference here is that now there is a true shifting of the task. So not is it just the student crafting and the work on their own, but they're now sharing it and posting it and receiving feedback from an authentic audience. With redefinition, here the students are now, this is essentially a problem-based example. Students are working in teams, they're creating a documentary video about a topic or a real-world issue. So instead of writing an essay, they're actually creating a documentary of that topic. They work in teams, they work with external subject matter experts through using Google Hangout or Skype as a means to bring in some additional authentic voices to substantially change the task, bring in different perspectives to inform their work as they create solutions. And so that's what the SAMR model looks like as it plays out into the classroom. So when we think about the SAMR model in terms of instructional design, the role of the SAMR model, again, is to inform the how. The SAMR model guides teachers to think about what are they trying to accomplish, what's the outcome they want students to demonstrate, and how does the SAMR model support their identification of the right technology tool. So SAMR does not replace some of these lesson and instructional designs, Inquiry Model, Madeline Hunter. It doesn't replace those. Those are frameworks that inform instructional design. What the SAMR model does is it guides teachers' intentionality around the tools that they use to support the kind of learning that is engaging and collaborative and reflects the 21st century skills that we want our students to demonstrate every day in the classroom. I'm going to now show you a couple of tools, and again, this will be on the resource the resource page at the end of the presentation, but I'm going to show you 3 tools that I think do a tremendous job of helping you to guide your planning and your support to teachers. So this is a SAMR rubric, a lesson rubric designed by the Pennyfield Schools in Michigan. This is a very easy rubric that is very easy to use. It provides very specific examples and guiding questions to help teachers be reflective about the tools they select, the technology tools they select to include in their instruction. Again, the intended audience here is a teacher or an instructional coach that's helping teachers plan and reflect on their learning. And there's the source there to this particular rubric. Another resource that helps, that actually walks you step by step in terms of a lesson evaluation. This video, it's about an 8-minute video. It walks you through what the SAMR model is, and it does a think aloud of the questions that you should ask as you begin to build an instructional opportunities that leverage the technology. It also provides guiding questions, but also examples of when does it make sense to place the technology there? Does the technology align sufficiently to the outcomes? So it's a really good step-by-step walkthrough to help teachers be reflective about their lesson design. And here's another, this is a rubric that targets administrators and instructional coaches, and quite frankly, a teacher could leverage this tool as well. This is a tool, a SAMR model lesson rubric. It was designed by Doug Johnson of Mankato Public Schools in Minnesota and Nathan Milkey in Germantown Public Schools in Wisconsin. This technology integration tool is aligned to the Danielson's framework model, but what it does is it does a beautiful job of walking you through around those 4 domains of effective instruction, effective teaching and learning, to help administrators and instructional coaches look for those behaviors that teachers should demonstrate and those planning questions that should guide the work that informs how teachers plan to integrate the technology. It's a fantastic resource that I think does a beautiful job of helping to lay out those proficiencies and the look-fors as you support teachers in integrating the SAMR model into their practice. So now what? So we've looked at the SAMR model, we've talked about what it is, why it has value into the classroom, and how we build it into our practice and how we support it with our teachers. I want to also be sure to share out some technology trends and developments, as well as some potential barriers as we think about technology integration. This, again, is some work that was done by Dr. Punadora, again, the designer of the SAMR model, where he identifies some key trends and some important developments that you'll see happening in the education space. Now, this is, again, his own work and research and speculation around the kinds of trends and developments that we would see happening in the K-12 space that I thought would be relevant to this conversation. So when we look at the key trends, these are the things that we see happening over the course of the next 5 to 7 years. So starting in our first 2 years, we're seeing more and more pervasive online learning, the need for collaborative environments, the need to include more social media. As we shift into the 3 to 5 year range, again, assessment is becoming critically important, and how do we ensure that we're building out authentic assessment? And then finally, the long-term range, the agile, the evolution of knocking down brick and mortar and being this kind of anytime, anywhere online learning experience. Some key technology developments, we already see this today, the flipped classroom and the learning analytics, but shifting more into 3D printing, gamification, and then finally the use of avatars and virtual assistants to drive and support learning and support intervention for our students. And then finally, these are some of the barriers that we continue to try to press through as we push to involve and integrate technology as more of an integral part of our work. And these are the places of increasing the fluency of our faculty, supporting and creating opportunity for collaboration in professional learning communities, creating the policies and the models to allow us to scale that innovation and to replicate those practices that we see happening beautifully. And then finally, the research and how are we expanding the access, but also expanding the knowledge of those best practices. So these are the trends and the developments and the barriers that we see happening in EdTech space that I thought were important to bring to mind and during this conversation. So these are the resources that I've referenced over our course of our conversation today. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I thank you so much for your time and your participation in this discussion. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach directly out to Matt. There's his email address as well as his phone number. And again, thank you so much for your time, and happy use of the SAMR model. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Hope, for your time today, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bye-bye.